I knew from the moment I moved into this neighborhood that the HOA was going to be a nightmare, but I never expected it to be this bad. It all started with my front yard. I had spent weeks working on it, carefully planting flower beds, adding decorative stones, and even putting in a small bird bath. Nothing extravagant, just a little touch of personality to make my home feel like mine. Then came the letter. A thick, official-looking envelope slid into my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's insignia. I opened it right there on my porch, and my blood pressure spiked before I even finished the first sentence. You are in violation of the HOA's landscaping regulations. Unauthorized alterations must be removed within 7 days, or you will face a fine of $500. I stared at the letter, my hands trembling with frustration. $500. For what? Some flowers, a bird bath. That's when I saw the signature at the bottom, Karren Whitmore, HOA president. Karren had been a thorn in my side since the moment I moved in. She was the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, strutting around in her pastel cardigans, clipboard always in hand. She lived to make people miserable, constantly nitpicking over the most absurd rules. I wasn't about to roll over and take this. I marched right over to her house, knocking firmly on the door. A few moments later, it swung open, and there she stood, arms crossed, lips pursed like she had just sucked on a lemon. "Georgia," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "How can I help you?" I held up the letter. "Care to explain this nonsense?" Her eyes flicked over the paper, and she let out a condescending chuckle. "It's all in the HOA guidelines, dear. You can't just plant whatever you want without approval. The board voted on this last year." I narrowed my eyes. I reviewed the guidelines before I planted anything. "There's nothing in there about needing approval for flowers," she shrugged. "Well, we've updated the regulations." I felt my jaw tighten. "You can't just change the rules whenever you feel like it." Karren gave me a smug look. "Actually, we can. The HOA board has full authority over neighborhood aesthetics. And if you don't comply, we will escalate the fine." I knew then and there that she wasn't going to back down. But what Karren didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with the wrong homeowner. I wasn't about to let some petty dictator bully me out of my own yard. I was going to fight back. And I was going to win. I didn't waste any time. The moment I got back to my house, I pulled out the thick HOA handbook I had been given when I moved in. I flipped through the pages, scanning every section related to landscaping. As I had suspected, there wasn't a single clause about needing approval for flowers, decorative stones, or bird baths. Karren had lied. If she was willing to fabricate rules just to exert control, I needed to find a way to fight back, and I had a feeling this wasn't the first time she had pulled something like this. The next morning, I started making calls. First, I reached out to a few neighbors who had lived in the community for years. As it turned out, I wasn't alone. Several of them had received similar bogus violation notices, all signed by Karren. Some had been forced to pay absurd fines, while others had given up and removed whatever Karren had deemed unacceptable. One elderly couple, the Petersons, had been fined over $1,000 for having a small vegetable garden in their backyard. Another neighbor, Lewis, had been threatened with legal action when he painted his front door navy blue instead of the HOA-approved beige. This was bigger than me. Karren had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, and no one had ever fought back. That was about to change. I spent the next few days gathering as much evidence as I could. I asked neighbors to send me copies of their violation letters, took photos of homes that had been unfairly targeted, and even dug up old HOA newsletters to compare past regulations to the supposed updates Karren had implemented. The more I uncovered, the worse it got. Karren hadn't just been making up rules, she had been funneling the collected fines into an administrative fund that had no oversight. The HOA board was supposed to vote on all financial decisions, but from what I could tell, Karren had been running things like her own personal fiefdom. It was time to take things to the next level. I scheduled a meeting with the city's Housing and Community Affairs Department. HOAs had to be registered and follow specific regulations to operate legally, and I had a strong suspicion that Karren had been bending more than just neighborhood rules. The meeting was eye-opening. The city official I spoke with, Mr. Langford, was immediately interested when I presented my evidence. He explained that HOAs were required to maintain transparency with financial records, and any changes to regulations had to be voted on by the homeowners, not just the board. Karren had broken multiple laws. I handed over every document I had, and Mr. Langford assured me they would launch an investigation, but I wasn't stopping there. That evening, I printed out flyers summarizing everything I had discovered. I went door to door, handing them out to every homeowner in the neighborhood. People were outraged. By the time I got back to my house, my phone was lighting up with messages from neighbors who wanted to take action. We decided to call for an emergency HOA meeting, the kind that Karren couldn't ignore. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community center was packed. Dozens of homeowners showed up, angry and ready for answers. Karren walked in with her usual air of superiority, but for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I stood up and addressed the crowd, laying out everything I had discovered. I presented the violation letters, the financial discrepancies, the illegal rule changes. Karren tried to cut me off, but the moment she opened her mouth, the room erupted. People were demanding refunds, demanding explanations, demanding her resignation. Then, just as the chaos reached its peak, Mr. Langford walked in. He had come personally to deliver the news. The city had officially revoked the HOA's license. Karren's face went pale as Mr. Langford explained that, due to multiple violations and financial mismanagement, the HOA was no longer recognized as a legal entity. The fines people had paid were now under investigation, and homeowners were no longer obligated to follow Karren's fabricated regulations. The neighborhood was free. Karren stormed out, humiliated, and within weeks, she sold her house and disappeared. The community came together to form a new, fair HOA with actual transparency and homeowner input. And as for my flowers and birdbath, they stayed right where they belonged. With Karren gone and the HOA dissolved, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. The oppressive fines, the arbitrary rules, the constant fear of getting another ridiculous violation letter, it all vanished overnight. For the first time in years, people felt like they owned their homes again. But the damage Karren had done wasn't so easily erased. The financial mismanagement left a mess that needed sorting. Many homeowners had paid hefty fines over the years, and now that the HOA was gone, they wanted their money back, but where had it all gone? The community center meetings continued, this time with a group of volunteers working to bring transparency where there had been none. Lewis, the neighbor who had been threatened over his front door color, had a background in finance. He took charge of combing through the HOA's records, which had been hastily abandoned when Karren fled. What he found was worse than any of us had expected. Karren had been funneling money into a personal account. Not only that, but she had been using HOA funds to pay for luxury expenses. Receipts showed charges at high-end boutiques, spa retreats, and even first-class airline tickets. She had treated the HOA like her own personal bank account, draining tens of thousands of dollars from the community. The outrage in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. People wanted justice. I took the lead in contacting the authorities again, this time with the financial evidence in hand. Mr. Langford, the city official who had helped take down the HOA, directed me to the proper channels. A formal complaint was filed, and within weeks, an investigation was underway. It didn't take long for law enforcement to track Karren down. She hadn't gone far, just a few towns over, hiding in a gated community where she no doubt planned to start her reign of terror all over again. When the authorities showed up at her new home, she tried to play the victim, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence was undeniable. Karren was arrested for embezzlement and fraud. The trial that followed was everything the neighborhood had hoped for. Homeowners testified about the unfair fines, the fabricated violations, the money they had been forced to pay under threat of legal action. Lewis presented the financial records, showing exactly how much had been stolen and where it had gone. Karren had no defense. In the end, she was convicted, ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners she had stolen from, and sentenced to time behind bars. The fallout left a lasting impact on the community. With the HOA permanently dismantled, the neighborhood had a newfound sense of freedom. People painted their houses whatever color they wanted. Gardens flourished without the fear of fines. Neighbors who had once been at odds now worked together to keep the community thriving. And as for me, my flowers and birdbath remained untouched, a quiet symbol of the battle we had won. With Karren out of the picture and the HOA officially dismantled, the neighborhood had a chance to rebuild. But there was still unfinished business. The financial mess she had left behind needed sorting out, and homeowners who had been unjustly fined wanted their money back. A small group of neighbors, including Lewis and the Petersons, took charge of the financial recovery effort. They worked with city officials to track down the stolen funds, but much of it had already been spent. What remained would be returned through legal restitution, but that process would take time. In the meantime, the community had to decide how to move forward without an HOA. Some residents worried that without any organized structure, the neighborhood would fall into disrepair. Others argued that the HOA had done more harm than good, and that a community could function just fine without an overbearing board micromanaging every detail. The debate was heated, but one thing was certain: nobody wanted another Karren in charge. To keep things fair, a new system was proposed. Instead of reinstating an HOA, a voluntary neighborhood committee would be formed. It would focus solely on organizing events, maintaining communal spaces, and handling minor disputes without the power to issue fines or enforce arbitrary rules. Every homeowner would have a vote, and no single person would have unchecked authority. The idea gained traction quickly. People were eager for a fresh start, but there was still lingering distrust from years of HOA abuse. To ease concerns, the committee's first order of business was full transparency. Every decision would be documented, and financial records would be available for anyone to review. Once the committee was up and running, the changes were immediate. The funds that had been recovered were used to repair neglected community spaces. Walking paths were repaved, playground equipment was updated, and a long-forgotten park bench was restored. Instead of being forced into compliance, people willingly contributed to improving the neighborhood because they finally had a say in how things were managed. Without the oppressive rules, homeowners took pride in their properties. Yards became vibrant with flowers and gardens, porches were decorated with personality, and no one feared receiving a fine for something as trivial as a navy blue door. The sense of community that Karren had crushed began to flourish. Meanwhile, I focused on making sure Karren's name never faded from memory, not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale. I worked with Lewis and a few other neighbors to draft a document detailing everything that had happened, from the fabricated fines to the financial fraud. It was archived with the city records, ensuring that no future HOA in our area could ever operate in secrecy again. The legal case against Karren continued, and every update brought a sense of satisfaction. She had tried to appeal her sentence, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Her fraudulent activities extended beyond just our neighborhood. She had been involved in similar schemes in at least 2 other communities before she moved here. Her downfall sent a clear message: corruption wouldn't be tolerated, and abusing power for personal gain had consequences. As the months passed, the neighborhood continued to thrive. Without the constant threat of fines, people felt more connected. Weekend gatherings became common, and for the first time in years, neighbors actually enjoyed living here. One evening, as I sat on my porch sipping tea, I noticed a group of kids playing in the street, something that had been rare under Karren's rule. Their laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had once gripped the neighborhood. Louis walked over, hands in his pockets, shaking his head with amusement. He had just finished repainting his front door again, this time a deep forest green. He casually mentioned how peaceful everything had become, and I knew he was right. The battle had been long, but we had won. Not just against Karren, but against the idea that one person could dictate how an entire community should live. And as I watched the neighborhood thrive in its newfound freedom, I knew that no one would ever allow another Karren to take control again. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood continued to flourish under its new system. Without the HOA's iron grip, people had the freedom to make their homes their own. Some repainted their houses in vibrant colors. Others installed garden lights or put up decorations that would have once earned them a violation notice. The changes weren't drastic, but they were meaningful, a symbol of the control we had reclaimed. Despite Karren's absence, there was still work to be done. The legal restitution process was slow, and while many neighbors had received some repayment from the recovered funds, others were still waiting. Louis and the financial committee stayed on top of the case, ensuring that every homeowner who had been wronged would eventually see justice. Meanwhile, I had taken on a new role in the community, not as a leader, but as someone people came to for advice. Neighbors who had once been wary of speaking out now felt comfortable approaching me with concerns, whether it was about lingering administrative matters or just small disputes between households. It wasn't an official position, but I didn't mind. If anything, it reinforced the sense of unity we had built. One afternoon, I received a call from a neighbor I hadn't spoken to much before. Her name was Denise, and she lived on the far side of the neighborhood. She sounded hesitant, but insisted that she had something important to share. When I arrived at her house, she led me inside, locking the door behind us as if she were about to reveal a deep secret. She placed a folder on the coffee table and slid it toward me. Inside were printed emails and scanned documents, all bearing the HOA's old letterhead. As I flipped through them, my stomach turned. Karren had been planning something much bigger than we had realized. Denise explained that she had once been close with one of Karren's former board members, a woman named Judith, who had quietly resigned months before the HOA collapsed. Before leaving, Judith had confided in Denise that Karren had been working on a plan to buy out multiple properties in the neighborhood using HOA funds. The goal had been to rent them out or resell them at inflated prices, using her position to manipulate property values in her favor. The plan had never come to fruition, likely because our efforts had shut her down before she could put it into action. But what struck me was how close she had come to pulling it off. Several homeowners had been pressured into selling over the past year, often under the pretense that their homes were out of compliance. Now it was clear that Karren had been trying to force them out. I knew we had to act on this information, even if Karren was already facing legal consequences. If she had managed to acquire properties through fraud, there might be more victims who had been manipulated into selling under false pretenses. Louis and I met with a legal consultant to discuss the findings. The consultant was intrigued and agreed that if homeowners had been coerced into selling, they might have grounds for legal action. But proving it wouldn't be easy. We needed to track down the former owners and gather statements. Over the next several weeks, we worked tirelessly to contact those who had sold their homes while Karren was in power. Some had moved out of state, while others had relocated to different neighborhoods nearby. The stories they shared painted a clear picture of Karren's scheme. She had used scare tactics, citing fabricated violations and threatening escalating fines. For those who had struggled financially, the pressure had been too much, and they had given in selling their homes at prices far below market value. As we compiled the evidence, we brought it to the same city officials who had helped us dismantle the HOA. They were shocked, but not entirely surprised. HOA corruption cases were more common than most people realized, but few communities were able to gather enough proof to take action. With the new information, additional charges were filed against Karren. This time, they included fraudulent property acquisition and real estate manipulation. The case was expanded, and the authorities began investigating whether any of Karren's former board members had been complicit. As the legal wheels turned, the neighborhood continued to evolve. The voluntary committee had successfully organized several community events, including a block party that brought together families who had barely spoken under the old HOA's rule. People who had once been strangers now shared meals and stories, strengthening the bonds that had been absent for so long. One evening, Denise invited me over again, this time with more good news. She had spoken to Judith, the former board member who had resigned before things got out of hand. Judith, feeling guilty for her past involvement, had decided to testify against Karren. Her insider knowledge would provide invaluable evidence, ensuring that Karren's actions wouldn't go unpunished. When the additional charges were finally brought to court, Karren's legal team scrambled to defend her, but the weight of evidence was too much. Between the fraudulent fines, the misappropriated funds, and the coerced property sales, there was no way out. The court ruled against her, ordering her to pay further restitution to the homeowners she had deceived. This time, it wasn't just about money, it was about justice. Several properties she had acquired through fraud were returned to their rightful owners, and those who had been forced to sell at reduced prices received compensation. The final blow came when the judge issued a permanent ban preventing Karren from ever holding a position of authority in any HOA or real estate organization again. The neighborhood had not only won, we had ensured that no one else would suffer under her manipulations. As the dust settled and life went on, I found myself reflecting on everything we had endured. What had started as a petty fine over landscaping had uncovered layers of corruption that no one had expected. If we had ignored it, if we had simply paid our fines and moved on, Karren would have continued her reign of exploitation. But we didn't back down. We fought, we uncovered the truth, and we took back what was ours. And as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood that had become stronger than ever, I knew one thing for certain: no one would ever let another Karren rise to power here again. With Karren permanently banned from ever holding authority over another HOA and her fraudulent real estate acquisitions undone, the neighborhood had finally rid itself of her influence. The community had transformed into something it had never been before, a place where people actually wanted to live, without fear of absurd fines or fabricated violations. But there was still one loose end. Karren may have been gone, but her former enforcers, the handful of board members who had stood by her side, rubber stamping every one of her ridiculous policies, were still living among us. While Judith had stepped forward to testify against Karren, the others had gone silent, hoping to blend back into the neighborhood like nothing had happened. That wasn't going to work. People still remembered the faces of those who had knocked on doors, delivering fines with smug satisfaction. They remembered the names of those who had voted in favor of Karren's policies, the ones who had turned a blind eye while she drained the HOA's funds for personal luxuries. If they thought they could quietly slip back into normal life without consequence, they were sorely mistaken. It started subtly. Neighbors stopped inviting them to gatherings. Conversations would end the moment they approached. The people they had once bullied now treated them like ghosts, acknowledging them with nothing more than cold, disinterested glances. For a while, they tried to act as if they didn't care. Then the real backlash began. Lewis, ever the numbers guy, dug into the records of those board members and found something interesting. 2 of them had been receiving suspiciously large administrative stipends from the HOA's funds. They hadn't been just bystanders, they had financially benefited from Karren's corruption. That revelation spread like wildfire. Furious homeowners confronted them directly, demanding explanations they couldn't give. One of them, a man named Richard, tried to defend himself by claiming he had just followed orders. That excuse didn't fly. The community had suffered for years under Karren's rule, and anyone who had willingly enabled her wasn't about to be forgiven. One by one, they cracked under the pressure. Richard put his house up for sale within a month. The others soon followed, unwilling to endure the hostility of the very people they had once ruled over with an iron fist. By the end of the year, every single one of Karren's enforcers had left. With them gone, the last remnants of the corrupt regime had been wiped away. The voluntary neighborhood committee, built on transparency and mutual respect, took full control of what little administrative work remained. But unlike before, there were no secret meetings, no arbitrary fines, no abuses of power. Everything was done out in the open, with decisions made by consensus, not by self-appointed tyrants. The neighborhood flourished. Small businesses began popping up. Residents who had once been restricted by HOA policies now felt free to set up home-based ventures. A retired couple started a weekend farmers market in their driveway, selling fresh produce. Another neighbor, an artist, opened a small pottery studio in her garage. What had once been a sterile, overly controlled environment had turned into a thriving, welcoming community. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in my mailbox this time, not from an HOA, but from a law firm. I opened it cautiously, skimming through the dense legal jargon until I found the shocking part. Karren had tried to sue me. Apparently, she blamed me for everything: her downfall, her arrest, the loss of her properties. The lawsuit claimed I had led a malicious campaign against her, that I had slandered her reputation, and that my actions had caused her emotional distress. She was demanding damages in the amount of $250,000. I almost laughed. The nerve of this woman. Even after everything, she still thought she could manipulate the system to her advantage. I didn't waste any time. I forwarded the letter to a lawyer, a friend of Lewis's who had been following our case from the beginning. He assured me there was nothing to worry about. Karren had no case. She had been convicted of fraud, her crimes were public record, and everything I had done had been based on documented evidence. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I gathered every file, every record, and every statement I had collected over the past year. I prepared for the possibility of going to court, knowing that if Karren wanted a fight, I would give her one. But it never came to that. A few weeks later, her case was thrown out before it even reached trial. The judge dismissed it as frivolous, and Karren was ordered to pay my legal fees. That was the last I ever heard of her. With her final, desperate attempt to retaliate crushed, there was nothing left for her to cling to. She faded into obscurity, her name becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale among HOAs across the city. And the neighborhood, it thrived. Without Karren's interference, property values actually went up, not because of arbitrary rules, but because people genuinely wanted to live here now. The sense of community was stronger than ever, built on trust, not fear. One evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the neighborhood kids play freely in the yard without worrying about unauthorized decorations or unapproved landscaping, I realized just how far we had come. We had taken back our neighborhood, and no one would ever let another Karren take control again.